I remember the first time I met Small. I was on my way to my very first porch revival tour of the school year with dreams of being the best Northside neighbor I could be. I passed his house that was nestled on the corner of Sykes and Craig and called out, "Are you coming to the porch revival tour?" to this stranger sitting on the porch. He looked confused at first, but eventually agreed he would see me there. I arrived to the beautiful home on Craig and began setting up tables and chairs, and soon enough that stranger from the porch came strolling by. He picked out a seat in the front yard, and I sat down next to him. I love meeting strangers, and I was immediately drawn to this stranger. "Hi, my name is Noam like poem," I introduced myself. "Small," he replied. "Nice to meet you." Within no time, we were talking about cooking and first jobs and favorite foods and time in prison and making fun of me for being a vegetarian and not really being able to cook. The friendship felt so instant, and at first I struggled with the word friendship, but friendship is what it is. I began strolling around the corner to see him at his home, and I would wave from my porch when I would see him walk back from his walks downtown, which I make fun of him for calling it a downtown because it's just one street, Franklin Street, but he's from Burlington, and Burlington is small, so it makes sense. He was born and raised in Burlington by his mom, who he says would do anything for him. His mom and most of his siblings still reside there, and he visits them as often as he can. Small was in Burlington over Thanksgiving, and we called and exchanged some words of gratitude and wished each other's families a happy Thanksgiving as well. It made me think back on this entire semester and the reason why I was even friends with Small in the first place. Through this course, Performance and Culture, we had been working with the Jackson Center, which focused on saving and making history, the history of Northside and its neighbors. The Jackson Center preserves these histories through recordings of fleeting memories, through people sharing their past and representing themselves and to us. For this course, me and my partner throughout the whole thing, Derek, set off to preserve our own oral history, the story and the past of Small. This was his take on it.
The date was October 15th, 2018, around 6:30 p.m. Noam, who was already friendly with Small, had already facilitated the time and place of our interview with him. At this point, I had only met Small once, and very briefly so, at the block party at the softball field of Hargraves Rec Center. Admittedly, I was a bit concerned prior to the interview. This was mostly due to the fact that Noam mentioned he's typically not very talkative and tends to give a lot of short answers. I was a bit worried that my presence, as an outsider compared to Noam's and Small's already budding friendship, would cause Small to be less willing to open up to us. Also, I was still trying to figure out how to use the voice recorder obtained from the Jackson Center, which was a bit stressful, given that it was at the last minute. Essentially, I just want to give off a good first impression and become friends with Small so he could feel as comfortable as possible during their interview in his Pee-wee home. As we walked towards Small's place, which was just down the street from Noam's house on Whitaker Street, I was still a tad bit nervous. I let Noam lead the way, as she knew not only where to go, but also the people who resided at the residence. We ended up briefly stopping by to greet some residents who lived directly adjacent to Small's residence, and then knocked on his front door. We greeted him at the door, and he welcomed both of us inside. Noam had forgotten the Jackson Center forms that we needed Small to sign from her house, which was rather serendipitous in hindsight, as it offered an opportunity for myself to become acquainted with Small before the interview. He had a football game on the TV, so we just had some small talk about sports and where I was from. But after Noam came back, we had become a lot more comfortable around one another by having this impromptu one-on-one time. For the interview itself, Small sat at the edge of his bed, near where his TV was, as Noam and I pulled up chairs near the edge of the bed, recorder in hand. I couldn't help but over-dramatize the moment in my head at the time. I was thinking, this is the moment of truth. Hopefully all goes well.
I took a deep breath in that moment. I was excited for this interview to begin. I was excited to know more about my friend Small, and I was excited to find out what makes Small small and how in the world Small and I ended up 2 doors down from each other in Chapel Hill. But the thing about that moment, no matter how important and special it wasn't the moment of truth for me. The moment of truth for me is all of the lunches that me and Small share and the conversations we have over them. It's the phone calls where he tells me everything will be all right no matter how stressed I am. It's the fact that he's worried about me whenever I get really busy with work and I haven't called in a couple of days. The truth is that Small is a complex human being with so many memories and emotions and stories to share. And I think I struggled with this project a lot because I had to represent my friend who is more than just an oral history. From this 1 hour interview, I was supposed to construct an entire project to represent him. So I decided to let go of that. I'm not going to try to represent Small with this project, and I'm not going to try to explain our entire relationship. But I want to touch on the points that the interview did bring up and made me think about more. One of the topics Small brought up in his interview was the broken system of our prison reform. Here's what he had to say.
I used to sell drugs, that's what I used to do. And use drugs and sell drugs most of my life. In and out of prison, and stuff like that, man. So, But now I kind of turned my life around. And everything is going smooth. But it's been kind of rough over the years. I did a lot of prison time for drugs. I go to prison, get out, start back selling drugs, go back to prison, get out, start back selling drugs, go back to prison. Just a routine, revolving door, in and out, in and out.
Small addresses a host of issues regarding the relationship between race, addiction, and the criminal justice system. Many of these problems were a direct result of the War of Drugs, declared by President Nixon in 1971. This war served as a cover for Nixon to go after the African American civil rights movement and the anti-war left. Law enforcement disproportionately targeted people of color for drug violations, resulting in an attempted breakup of their communities and discrediting their leaders. Conversely, the upper class, of which the majority is white, was not at all held to the same standard. Oftentimes, they were able to get away with far worse drug-related offenses than those that would immediately incarcerate people of color. The overwhelming racial and socioeconomic disparity in mass incarceration for these nonviolent crimes that has resulted from this war on drugs are flagrant and still pervasive in today's society. Fortunately, there do exist initiatives that directly combat the injustices from this broken system. For example, there is the Equal Justice Initiative, which provides legal representation to prisoners who may have been wrongly convicted of crimes, poor prisoners without effective representation, and others who may have been denied a fair trial. However, there is far more work to be done. Addressing each individual unjust sentence requires an inordinate amount of legal work, making progress difficult and efficient. The criminal justice system needs reform down to its core, which also presents its own host of challenges.
Small talks candidly and openly about his drug use and his struggle with addiction. He shared his many attempts to overcome substance abuse and talked to us about programs he did in Connecticut and homes he stayed in New York. He finally has cleaned himself up and talks about the pride that has come with that.
I got a good family, My father, he's dead, but my mother, she's still alive. And, she really has looked out for me over the years. She never turned her back on me. I talk to her about it 2 or 3 times a week. She's been down here to stay with me and everything. Spent the night with me. And she's proud of me. Everybody's proud of me because I've come a long ways. And I'm kind of proud of myself.
Many misconceptions surround addiction. It is mistakenly thought of as the result of immorality and choice. But substance abuse is experienced by communities of color due to poor access to care and inappropriate care, as well as social, environmental, and economic risk factors. Addiction is a chronic disease with harmful consequences. To contextualize the issue, imagine someone with type 1 diabetes who ends up in jail. They still receive insulin to maintain their blood sugar. However, in cases of addiction, any medication aiding sobriety is stopped once the person enters the prison system. The withdrawal symptoms are barely manageable, and relapse is inevitable as a result. Small stories make me angry at the system that failed him over and over again. and they urge me to think about addiction and drug consumption differently. There are many issues that I have thought of differently as a result of my friendship with Small. I never thought I would have a friend who spent a majority of their adult life in prison, let alone one who already spent a majority of their adult life. Our odd friendship, he calls it unique, is one that I cherish and I'm thankful for. And despite struggling with this project and the responsibility of sharing Small's story, when I asked him how he wanted to be represented and what he wanted the world to know about him, he responded, "I don't have anything to hide. Just sharing my story has helped me heal." Healing has been a process for me as well this semester, and exchanging stories with Small has aided that process. Although this project marks the end of this class, it luckily only marks the beginning of my friendship with Small.